is based on resources of water and resources from other parts of the world. I'm aware that I'm producing carbon dioxide, and I would like to be mindful in my use of these resources. Okay, so I think especially in the context of the COP26, it is important to consider energy and our use of energy as well. And therefore, I just felt that it would be important to show you that Canada is currently, or has been, this is 2016, but nothing changed a lot. So Canada is using 5.1 times more energy per capita than the world average. And I think we should also think about that. I'm sorry that I'm sometimes searching my on the screen, because on Zoom there are so many different fields, and I have to shift them a little bit so that I can orient myself. Thank you, Sheila, for introducing me. I'm associate professor at the Center for Engineering in Society. Sheila already told you. And the Center for Engineering in Society is a specific department in Concordia University in the School of Engineering and Computer Science, because we are dealing actually with social impact of technology and science. I myself am trained as a physicist and a physics educator. I was teaching physics back in Europe, in Austria and in Germany. And in 2018, I joined Concordia University. Before that, I was at the School of Education in Austria, professor there. And therefore, I did a lot of teacher trainings, and I'm very happy to be with STEO today. I haven't had so much opportunities to connect with teachers in Canada, but I think that's a great event, and I would like to congratulate you to organize this event despite the pandemic and having a beautiful online event. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the human rights as a very interesting and important framework when we think of science education. I will show you that diversity and social power relations can be investigated, can very well be investigated through the lens of the human rights. And I will show you how the human rights approach can be applied to the right to science education and what the right to science education means. Human rights are especially valuable when it comes to identifying vulnerabilities and intersectional discrimination in the context of science education. They are especially valuable as an alternative or even a complementary framework to the very well-known output and economy-oriented framework that is very often defining the goals of science education. I had the opportunity to briefly attend the talk of Janice Williams before about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's so important to think about goals, to rethink values, and to redefine values of science education. Now, please excuse me when I'm taking a broader perspective when I talk about education, because science is a part of education, and therefore I will talk about the right to education in general. And one indicator if the right to education is fulfilled or not is literacy rate. We know that the literacy rate is very unequally distributed among the world. In Canada and in the Western countries, and also in US, in Australia, also in Latin America, South America, there is a very high, the literacy rate is very high, but there are certainly countries, especially on the African continent and in Asia, where the literacy rate is very low. So this is one of the major concerns of UNESCO, and one of the major challenges for the right to education. 6 out of 10 young people, only 6 out of 10 young people will be finishing secondary school in 2030. 773 million illiterate adults are now around the world. In 47% of countries, upper secondary education is not compulsory, and 99 million youth between 15 and 24 years lack basic literacy skills. So these are the major concerns. And when we talk about science education, we always have to think of it embedded in the bigger picture of education. The human rights approach is a very specific approach, a very important approach, because it is not centering economic interests, but it is centering the individual human beings. The human rights approach is based on specific documents and declarations. The most important declaration is the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. Then the specific declaration on the right to education, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And what is common of all these declarations is that they are not centering economic values or values of, let's say, simply progress values, but values of human beings or human communities. Rights of indigenous peoples are community rights, for example. Now I will go through these documents in order to develop an understanding how science education can be aligned in accordance with these documents. The Universal Declaration of the Human Rights is a milestone document in the history of human rights. It was drafted by representatives from all regions of the world after the Second World War, and it was based on worldwide experiences of discrimination, torture, slavery, and oppression. The declaration sets out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected. It has been translated in 500 languages, and it is a historic document since it outlines the rights and freedoms for everyone. It was the first international agreement on basic principles of human rights, and it laid the foundations of the human rights protections that we have currently in Canada today, and it is the basis for the Canadian Human Rights Act. Very closely related to the human rights is the Sustainable Development Goals and also the right to education. The right to education is enshrined in the Declaration of the Human Rights. Both individuals and society benefit from the right to education. It is a fundamental right for human, social, and economic development, and it is a key element to achieving lasting peace and sustainable development. It is understood as an empowerment right in the sense that it lifts marginalized groups out of poverty. And it is an indispensable means of realizing other rights, such as the right to free speech and other human rights. The right to education cannot be transferred or renounced. So nobody can say, I renounce my right to education, I sell it or whatever. It is not possible. And what is also very helpful and very interesting is that the right to education, or the access to the right to education, is structured by 4 characteristics. These 4 characteristics are called the 4A characteristics. I will talk about them in a minute. The right to education, the third document, I'm sorry, I was a little bit confused with my 2 screens and the third screen. The third document, which is a framework document for the rights of STEM education, is the rights of indigenous peoples, and especially Article 14 and Article 15. I consider these 2 articles, of particular interest when we are thinking of decolonizing academia and also indigenizing academia, but especially decolonizing academia, because this addresses the content of science education, the content and the goal of science education. Now in Article 14 says, indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their culture, methods of teaching and learning. Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination. In Article 15, it says, indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. So the Declaration of the Right of Indigenous Peoples is a very important document for the framework. Canada officially adopted the declaration in 2016 and promised to implement the declaration fully. What is included is the question of what are the opportunities for Indigenous peoples to establish and control their own educational systems in their own languages with their own cultures and methods, but also how is public education, provincial education, Canadian education open to Indigenous peoples, and is it discrimination free? In my preparation of the talk today, I was browsing the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I found a very interesting activity on their website. And this activity encourages students to evaluate whether their school, or students and teachers, whether their school is in accordance with the human rights. Students are asked to rate rate questions. For example, my school is a place where all students, teachers, and staff feel safe and secure, and they should rate from 1 to 4 if this applies to their school. I think this is a very nice activity to make students familiar with the human rights, and also to make them see their own field in which they are living and working and studying and learning related to human rights. So I think this is a great opportunity, and maybe you would like to take a look at that as well. Now, central to the human rights framework is that discrimination is strictly forbidden and there are defined grounds of discrimination. This approach is important, and I would like to emphasize it, as it reminds us that we should be careful to not essentialize social categories. So, for example, in the human rights, you will see that they speak about human beings, but not about different kinds of people. So they really tried to avoid that, simply because human rights apply for everyone, and we are equal, at least in one characteristics. We are all human beings. So human beings are really the center of the human rights, and human beings are made different. There is a social order. There is a social order which is structured along specific lines, along different lines of difference. So it's called the lines of difference. And these lines of difference or grounds of discriminations are age, ancestry, citizenship, ethnicity, creed, disability, and so on, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on. So these are the forbidden grounds. Now, when we ask the question, how can we even assess if there is equity in education, if there is equity in the educational system, then we might want to take a look of what exactly is an educational system and how does it work. And I found this in the Handbook of Measuring Equity Education, and I found this as a very practicable approach. We have a part of input. So input is a relevant factor of education. Then there are intermediate processes such as teacher trainings. Teachers, is there quality teacher training available? Are there school facilities? Are schools available? Then we have the output component, which is the enrollment rate or grade completion or exposure of students to quality teaching. And we have the outcome, which is the learning outcomes and the qualifications, the degrees. And the ultimate outcome is a better life, higher wages, better health, and the empowerment for people to choose the life that they want to have. So we are very often used to look at, when we assess equity and equity in education, to look at the outcomes and at the qualifications. This makes sense because they are a very good indicator which shows us if the educational system works or not. However, after that, we very often attribute the deficits to the students and to specific groups. And that is actually the tricky part. So we should always have to have the whole educational system in mind. Before I mentioned the 4A approach of the human rights, and I'm now explaining it a little bit more. This is the structure to assess if the right to education is fulfilled. The 4A scheme was developed by, further developed by Katerina Tomaszewski in 2006. Unfortunately, she died much too early, and she was a great UNESCO and human rights activist. Now, maybe you are even familiar with the A4A scheme because it is very often used in the context of accessibility and for people with disabilities, people with disableism, I would say. But this approach is very practicable also for all other fields and especially also for science. Now I go through the 4A's. The first A stands for availability, and it says education must be free, infrastructure, buildings, books, materials must be available, and there must also be qualified staff and teacher training. If this is not fulfilled, then we cannot consider education, the right to education, fulfilled. Now we would say, okay, probably in Canada, this is fulfilled, but I'm not sure. If we look at the northern communities, they say that there is a lack of education, specifically of qualified science teachers. So we can say that the availability might not be fulfilled there. Accessibility. Accessibility means that education and science education is equally accessible physically and economically, regardless of socioeconomic background, language, religion, ethnicity, or any other grounds. So also here we can ask, is this true? Is education accessible for everyone? And we know that there are socioeconomic differences, socioeconomic disparities in education. So whenever there are socioeconomic differences, or when disparities in STEM education are a consequence of socioeconomic backgrounds, then we can say that there is an issue with accessibility. Acceptability means that curricula and lessons are unbiased and free of discrimination and acceptable for all students. Acceptable for all students. So acceptability is of particular interest for the context of decolonizing science education, because we know that science played a role in colonialism. Science played its role in constructing race, in constructing racial binaries. And therefore, we cannot consider, or we cannot be sure that all scientific context is really acceptable for all students. So context which is reinforcing power relations, context which is reinforcing binaries and binary thinking is actually not considered to be acceptable, especially for the oppressed students. And finally, adaptability. Adaptability means that educational programs must be flexible and adaptable to changes in society. We saw in the last months that this is difficult. So the pandemic, for example, was a test if our educational system is adaptable, because a pandemic, even during war, students or human beings have the right to education. There is also a 5A, which is accountability. Who is accountable if the right to education is not fulfilled? So this is not the part of the classical 4A scheme, but it is also has also be considered. Okay, now let's take one more look at the outcome assessment. PISA is one of the most prominent outcomes and students' outcomes or performance assessments. And here we see that Canada is doing very well and Ontario is doing very well. So Canada and Ontario are way ahead of the average of students' performance, the OECD average. So Canadian students perform very well, which means Canadian schools are doing very well. When we look at specifically at the integration of immigrant students, then the last PISA study shows that second generation immigrant students obtained higher scores than non-immigrant students, which means we cannot speak of discrimination of immigrant students or second generation immigrant students. The opposite is the case, for example, in Germany. Second generation immigrant students in Germany perform worse than first generation immigrant students. So this seems to be all doing well, right? It seems to be great. However, when we take a closer look, then we find disparities. And I would like to mention especially the gender disparities and then also the disparities of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Amongst high-performing students in mathematics or science, about 1 in 3 boys in Canada expects to work as an engineer, while only 1 in 7 girls expects to do so. 7% of boys and 1% of girls in Canada expect to work in ICT-related professions. So 7 times more boys than girls expect to work in ICT-related professions. And in almost every educational system, including Canada, girls expressed greater fear of failure than boys. And this gender gap was considerably wider amongst top performing students. So this is definitely an indication that something is wrong with science education, that science education is not addressing boys and girls equally. And we are working on that since 50 years. We are trying to close the gap. We are also closing the gap. Girls are actually, or female students are actually performing even better sometimes, but their aspirations to become engineers is low. I want to show you a study called the ROSE Project, Relevance of Science project, which was conducted in 2010 or until 2010. And I think this study is so interesting, and therefore I want to bring it to your attention. Although it is 11 years old, but what the authors are Camilla Schreiner and Sven Sjöberg, and what they did was they compared different countries around the world. Unfortunately, Canada is not part of these countries, but especially a lot of African countries, a lot of European countries, a lot of Asian countries were part of the study. And they asked students, boys and girls, if they would like to become a scientist. And what's the surprising, or maybe not so surprising outcome is that in poor countries, nearly everybody wants to become a scientist, and there is nearly no difference between boys and girls, but they do not have the possibility. So it's an availability issue. Whereas in wealthy countries, nearly nobody wants to become a scientist. And of these very little group that is interested in becoming a scientist, there are even fewer girls. So we have to rethink our, I would say, narrative that we are used to use, that girls are not interested in science. There are huge differences across the world. And we also have to rethink our narratives that boys are interested in science. Also, very few boys are interested in science, and of these very few boys, but they are more than girls. But it's not that all boys are interested in science. So this was an interesting outcome. Another question that they asked was, I would like to get a job in technology. So would you like to get a job in technology? In wealthy countries, nearly no girl wants to work with technology, and even boys are ambivalent, especially in Japan. A very low percentage of girls wants to get a job in technology. Whereas in poor countries, everybody or a lot of people want to work in technology, but we see a certain gender gap. However, in poor countries, more percent of girls want to work in technology than percent of boys in wealthy countries. So again, here, we cannot speak of a gender, a worldwide or universal gender gap in STEM. It is obviously closely linked to culture. It is obviously closely linked to the wealth of a country and to the well-being of the people. Okay, now I'd like to take a look at the tertiary education in Canada. And here other disparities become apparent, where we see that far less Indigenous adults have completed tertiary education than non-Indigenous adults. Non-Indigenous adults are 2 to 3 times more likely to having completed tertiary education. And here they are looking especially at most populated Canadian metropolitan areas, so the main cities, Edmonton and Hamilton, Winnipeg, Montreal, and Ottawa, Gatineau. So this is a very important indicator that shows us that the indigenous population, we do not succeed in really addressing and educating the Indigenous population. When we take a look at employment in Canada, we see a similar pattern, and especially here I would like to highlight the 3 fields: business and finance, management, and natural and applied sciences, which are considered the knowledge occupations. And here we see that non-Indigenous persons are overrepresented and Indigenous persons are underrepresented. Indigenous persons, adults, were asked why they left and what barriers were the highest barriers that they, or the most important barriers that they experienced. And they said one of the most important barriers or highest barriers was that courses were not matching the needs, the costs, personal and family responsibilities, and the lack of personal priority. And when we now think of the 4A scheme, then we can say, okay, family responsibilities. It could be that the courses were somewhere and the family's responsibilities were in another place. And this didn't, so the person was not possible to combine the studies with family responsibilities. This could be an availability problem, could also be an adaptability problem. Accessibility is certainly, we can certainly find accessibility issues in the costs. And acceptability issues we can find when the persons are speaking of that the courses are not matching the needs, right? Because this is about the courses and about the content. Okay, so now I will show you a metaphor or a picture, an image, which is very often used as a metaphor to illustrate the underrepresentation of women and other marginalized groups in the STEM fields, which is the leaky pipeline metaphor. What does the leaky pipeline metaphor say? And I'm sure you heard about it, and there are a lot of drawings with the leaky pipeline. The leaky pipeline is symbolizing the education pipeline. And let's see it as a STEM education pipeline. And normally we would think of diverse students that are entering the pipeline, and over the time, students are dropping out, right? They are dropping out. And in the end, only a very small group of students is leaving the pipeline, is successfully leaving the pipeline with a degree, for example. This could be bachelor degree, or it could just be high school. Now, what's interesting and problematic is, I mean, the group is quite small. However, this is not the main problematic point. The problematic point is that the homogeneity of the group is larger than the group of before. So the group at the end is not as diverse as the group that entered the pipeline. What are the worldwide current, I would say predominantly, the predominant answers to this situation? Trying to fix the pipeline, trying to fix the leaks of the pipeline, raising the interest, trying to keep students in this STEM pipeline. But maybe we should also question the pipeline itself, right? So because the pipeline symbolizes the educational system, the pipeline symbolizes the values of science, it symbolizes the goals of science and the content that we are teaching. So the human rights approach calls for questioning the pipeline as well. I'm not trying to translate this to another picture. Here are again the diverse students that we are used to deal with, I would say, in the discourse. So we are speaking of diversity, we're speaking of diverse students, and we might not always be aware that we are using these categories maybe in an essentialist way. And especially studies on the performance of students are often linking the deficits with diversity categories. So we should be very careful with that. And when we take into consideration the different disparities in performance, then we find a distribution among the different performance levels of PISA. It would be like this, right? And we have students that are low performers and high performers. And we see that they are different. Okay, so fixing the leaks means that we are trying by compensatory measures to lift the students in higher levels, but sometimes this is only a symptom therapy. Maybe we are not really addressing the root of the problem. We have to take into account, in order to think of diversity in the context of social power relations, we have to take into account social theory. And we have to think about that diversity is rather developed and produced than existing. So for example, when we talk about specific high performers and specific low performers, and we say that, for example, girls are low performing, then we should always think it in combination. We are producing, the educational system is producing low performing girls, right? So all the category, because low performance is basically an outcome of the educational system, and the identity construction as girls is also an outcome of the educational system. So it somehow fits together. I try to explain that a little bit more. Diversity is a general characteristics of all individuals. We are used to deal with that when we say, okay, all are different and all are diverse. But however, in the context of social power relations, we have to think of diversity as existing inequity. And you might be familiar with the three main categories of difference that are gender, race, and class. And we are speaking of lines that establish social orders of oppression and privilege by making human beings different based on gender, race, and class. So these are the lines that are producing and constructing social order. And we also know that these lines are crossing, they are intersecting, which means this is creating specific vulnerable situations for individuals. There are many more lines of difference. For example, Eurocentrism, heterosexism, ableism, educationalism, ageism, and so on. And you can even add other lines of difference. However, what is common, or what they have in common, is that there is a privileged group and there is an oppressed group. So there is a dichotomy between these groups. Now, let's go back to the human rights approach. I mentioned before that in the human rights, the human rights is centering human beings. And one very important aspect of human rights is that that human beings are equal. And in this equality, every human has and possesses the right to education and also to STEM education. Now, when we consider that, then we have to think of this picture in a different way. We have even to start one step before, like this. We are human beings, and due to different processes that are taking place in society, different processes of difference making on different levels, and we call that the intersectional selection and so on. I do not want to go too much into detail, but these levels are, for example, levels of identity construction, levels of representation and culture, and levels of structure and institutions. Due to these different levels, persons, peoples, individuals become different. And in the end, when you read the access to education through this lens, then we see, so this is a kind of a black box, and in the end we see that some people have access to education, and these people who have access to education do have different characteristics. They are highly successful in STEM, they have a good socioeconomic background, and they are predominantly white, Eurocentric, whereas there is a lack of access to education for other people, and they have other characteristics. So what is the difference, the important difference between this picture and the picture before? When we talk about disparities in education, and we want to shift our focus from the differences of the individuals to the issues in the educational system, then we have to take a look onto this black box and not on the disparities and the performance of the individuals. So what I was trying to do is to shift the attention from the difference of the individuals to the educational system. And that's exactly what I'm doing in my work. And in this sense, we cannot speak anymore of disparities of education or disparities in performance. We rather should speak of disparities in access to STEM. And here we see accessibility to STEM. So for STEM education, the big question is, how is STEM education contributing to that? How is STEM education contributing to difference making and to producing high and low performance? Recently, I published, together with my co-editors and with co-authors, a book called The Human Rights-Based Approach to STEM Education. And the foundation of this book was laid in 2018 at the symposium in Berlin, the first symposium on the right to STEM education. And in this book, we outline the theoretical framework and also the practical framework. The book is open accessible, so you can just go to the publisher's website, Waxman Publisher, and download the book if you're interested. And I would be happy if you, if we could exchange some thoughts about that as well. Okay, so in this book, we outline how the human rights approach can be applied to STEM education and to the field of STEM education. And there are three main points that we consider in this book. First, science is a common good. This is a very important aspect of the right to science education. Second, science and education must be accessible and acceptable for learners. That is referring to the 4A scheme. And third, acceptability includes that the content of science does not reproduce discrimination, social power relations, and stereotypes. So, and we have authors from many different countries, and also a very nice chapter about decolonizing approaches from Brazilian authors. The Declaration of the Right to STEM Education is structured in 3 paragraphs, and I do not want to go through it in detail. I already summarized it. It is about availability of and accessibility to science education. It is also about science education that needs to follow an integrated approach with the general vision of science as a common good. And it is about framing the quality of science education as acceptability. Science education which does not meet the needs of students is not considered to be acceptable. Science education which is reproducing power relations is not regarded as acceptable. The Berlin Declaration is published also in the book, so you can read it in detail. Okay, and what I'm doing with my students and in my work is we are trying to find other ideas for the pipeline, and we are trying to challenge the pipeline and what could be the options. Here you see Carlos Mometti. He is a student from the University of Sao Paulo, and I'm co-supervising his PhD research, and he's comparing Canadian and Brazilian curricula and is identifying patterns of colonialism in science curricula. He's actually a physics teacher in Sao Paulo. And another student that I would like to mention is Tatiana Zanon. She's also a PhD student, and she is studying social power relations in science textbooks. This is an example of her research. So what is she doing? She's investigating science textbooks across Canada and is analyzing pictures and texts. And in the pictures, she is analyzing how marginalized groups are portrayed, how marginalized groups are represented. And this is an example of her analysis of an undergraduate physics textbook. And what's interesting is that many textbooks, so for example, here you see MSc and FSc means male and female persons represented in scientific activities. MHSC, FHSC means male and female persons represented as historically known scientists, famous scientists. MF and MFS means represented as athletes in sports, because sports is very often used to illustrate mechanics, forces, and so on. And MNI and FANI means people illustrated or people depicted in non-identifiable situations, non-scientific situations. What we see is that there is a huge representation of Black and people of color, and actually an overrepresentation if you compare it with the representation in society in non-scientific activities. But we also see that there is no Black and no person of color in scientific activities present in this particular physics undergraduate textbook. What we also found is that the science textbooks of secondary school are actually presenting diversity very well. So you see representation of marginalized groups across the, let's say, activities. You see scientists, men, women, people of color, so that is all represented. However, when you go into the text and you analyze the narrative, then Tatiana found that there are still that the narrative of white Western science and scientific authority is still reproduced. So I'm happy to keep you posted about this research. It's a very interesting research, and we are also planning to develop a critical reading guide in order to handle textbooks. Okay, so how can we move forward? I think it is important to connect STEM content to society. I think this is really important. And to ask questions. How is STEM teaching content related to social order and to social difference? How are we narrating technology and innovation? And what are the values? And who defines them? I would like to quote, to use this quote of Langdon Winner, who says, "The things we call technologies are ways of building order in our world." Now, as I mentioned, diversity. It might not be enough to consider diversity in the sense of who is scientist. This is important. It is important because it will also change the culture. But at the same time, we need to question, what is science? What do we consider as science? This refers to the content that has to be acceptable, the needs of the learners that have to be addressed. Maybe we even have to rename it, I don't know, but it is an important question and a very challenging question. And what are the politics of science? Who is benefiting from these narratives? This question examines the social power relations. Okay, now I'm giving you an example of how social power relations can play a role in science and can be a topic in science. And the example is bridges. We use bridges in order to, at all school levels, I would say, in order to discuss statics, in order to discuss forces, and so on. So bridges are really something that every child and every student knows. There is an example in history which links bridges very well to social power relations, namely the bridges over the parkways on Long Island, New York. Many of these overpasses are extraordinarily low, and we might not even give it a second thought. However, the master builder of these roads, parks, and bridges and other public works between 1920 to 1970 was Robert Moses. And he built these overpasses specifically low to discourage the presence of buses on parkways. According to his biographer, Robert Carroll, the reasons reflect Moses' social class and racial bias, because only upper and middle class people could afford an automobile. They could use the parkways for recreation and commuting. However, poor people normally used public transit and buses, and they were kept off the roads because the buses could not handle the overpasses. So the consequence was that racialized groups did not have access to recreation areas. That is a story, I think, which all engineering students maybe should also learn. And this is I would say, a very an example which very well illustrates how engineering and how technology can contribute to social difference and to reinforce social power relations. So when we talk with students about bridges, we can discuss what is a bridge and how a bridge is built, but we should also discuss for whom a bridge is built. Another example I want to show is about tomatoes and the mechanical tomato harvester that was developed by researchers at the University of California since the late 1940s. The harvester replaced the traditional way of handpicking tomatoes. So the traditional way looks like that. Traditionally, farm workers would pass through the fields 3 or 4 times, taking the ripe tomatoes and save the immature fruits for later. The harvester is able to harvest tomatoes in a single pass. It is cutting the plants and shaking the fruits loose. And to accommodate the harvester and the rough motion of the harvester, new tomatoes had to be bred. And that was basically research which was going parallel to the development of the harvester. Researchers developed hardier and less tasty tomatoes than the previous ones. And we all know these tomatoes. Now, this new method was compatible only with a high concentrated form of tomato growing. And with the introduction of the harvester, the number of tomato growers and tomato farmers in California declined from approximately 4,000 in the early 1960s to about 600 in 1973. So what we see here is what Langdon Winner describes as an ongoing social process in which scientific knowledge, technological invention, and corporate profit reinforce each other in deeply entrenched patterns of political and economic power. Okay, so a juxtaposition of the perspectives. We have an economic perspective that we are very familiar with. STEM is often, or the importance of STEM education is often linked to progress, to innovation, to economic progress. Diversity is often seen as a human resource, and individuals are should fit ideally into STEM, and the focus is predominantly on performance and on skills and employability. And the skills are very often defined by, for example, by OECD or by economy. This is the economic perspective, whereas the human rights perspective sees science as a common good. Science must be acceptable. Everybody has the right to be educated and to participate in science, and the right is independent from economic exploitation. So I think this is a very important part of the human rights perspective. Now, finally, let me give you an example of a project which is a collaboration with international scholars and with the Kahnawake Environment Protection Office in Kahnawake, the indigenous community on the other side of the St. Lawrence River. And the project is addressing the questions of how science education can be made accessible also to adult learners. And these are the members that are involved in this project. And here we see the members from Kahnawake Environment Protection Office. Lynn Jacobs is the director, and Cole is the scientist and technician who is also very much involved. Julie is involved in the workshops and in the citizen science. So basically what we did is we sat down and we discussed with the KIPO, with the Kahnawake Environment Protection Office. We discussed what could be done. And in our discussions, it became very clear that air quality is of particular interest for Kahnawake, since Kahnawake is not covered by the Montreal City's air quality measurement. And in the end, we decided that the best way would be a citizen science project that is tailored to the needs of the community, and the community has the sovereignty of the project and of the data and everything. So I think this was a very important process to really sit down and to think together, what are the needs and how can we address these needs, or how these needs can be addressed by all of us. Now, to give you a little bit of an idea of Kahnawake, now this is the language, the English map that I first have shown in Mohawk language. Here is Kahnawake, and Kahnawake is a Mohawk territory with 8,000 people, 50 square kilometers area. And we see here that the main influence for affecting air traffic, affecting air quality, is the road traffic, because Kahnawake is here basically on the highway. Then another source for air pollution is the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Airport, with the machines taking off, the planes taking off. This is another major polluter of air. But the most, I would say, pollution or affecting air quality is marine traffic. And this is the map of the Atlantic Ocean. And here are all the vessels crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Here you see Ireland, here is Gaspé, here is Montreal. And you see that basically all vessels that are going through the Great Lakes are passing by Montreal, and specifically Kahnawake, because the Canal de la Rive Sud is on the shore of Kahnawake. So all these vessels are passing by Kahnawake.
So Tanya, it's Sheila, I don't want to interrupt you, but
oh my God, yeah. Oh my God. Okay, I'm already done. So what we are doing is we are doing this citizen science project where citizens are trained to build their own monitors and to collect their own data. This is called adjusting an air quality monitor at a house. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm sorry I lost the time. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, Tanya, thank you so much. I apologize for not jumping in earlier and giving you a head, because I was just fascinated with all of that information. I don't know whether anyone has any questions that they wanted to drop in the Q&A. We would be happy to answer them as well. But I made so many notes this evening. fascinating talk, and something that, you know, as science educators, we really need to be aware of, because the sad part when I listen to you talk is that I've been teaching for quite a while, and those statistics haven't changed, right? When we're looking at the number of young women in particular that go into science, and I do a project at my university with our Faculty of Business and Information Technology, where students have, you know, great opportunities to have jobs when they graduate. And we have like one young woman, you know, in these programs. And if she's still there at the end of 4 years, that's great. But, you know, how can we encourage them? And as science educators, what can we do to make sure that we're addressing some of those amazing points that you brought up this evening? Because so much of it has to do with our early educational system as well. How can we engage more young folks? You know, because I work with the Faculty of Education teacher candidates in a primary junior program, you know, we're not providing the opportunities for our future educators, right, to have a lot of this information. And that's something that STAO has struggled with for years, and the Minister of Education. How do we make sure that our teachers are helping to get this information out to our students as well? So again, thank you so much for amazing session this evening. Some interesting comments in the chat box as well. Student-centered to performance of the system. Yeah, good point. So again, if anyone has any, you know, last-minute questions they would like to raise, I know I'm going to go back and listen to this video later on, because I couldn't take notes all the way through because it's just too much information. So again, thank you so much. So any last-minute questions from any of the participants? If you just wanted to. So a question, I was wondering if you have specific advice to new science teachers on how to promote equity earlier in their teaching career. Oh, have you got some time for that one?
Yeah, I have time, and I appreciate the question. Thank you so much for your patience and for your attention and listening to me. So I think it's always interesting. I made the experience that it's interesting for students when you address equity in science education, when you address this, when you address discrimination in science education, you might lose some interest of some students, but you will win other interest of other students. And I think it's worth trying, you know, making science or presenting science as something that is embedded in society. Science is a product of society, and therefore there are all these structural elements in science as well. So I think this is interesting. And of course, it's also interesting to speak about the history of science. And I'm not talking about the history, you know, the famous scientists. I'm talking about the real history of science and also the colonial history of science. That is interesting for students. And then they feel that they are heard and that we are listened to them as well, because we are giving them space in the science lesson, and we are talking about this as well. So I think everything that does not reinforce the idea that science is separate from society and from societal order is good and is worth a try.
Good, thank you so much. So again, it's Friday evening. I know for those of you who are teachers, it's been a long week, and thank you so much for your active participation in our sessions this evening. And just a reminder that our sessions start tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and we just wanted to thank our sponsors. You'll see Explore Learning has been one of our sponsors that's helped make this conference happen. STAO is a not-for-profit organization that wants to make sure that science educators in Ontario have lots of resources and activities as well. So thank you so much, Tanya, and participants. Tomorrow there will be a link to a conference survey. If you wouldn't mind filling that in, that would be really helpful for us as a science organization to make sure that we are providing the resources for you. So thank you again, Tanya, and all of our attendees, and enjoy the rest of your Friday evening, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good Friday evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tanya, so many interesting statistics in your presentation this evening.
I'm muted. I was when I opened it, and then there was this screen, then there was another screen, and I didn't find my notes.
I only have one screen, but I know exactly, I know.
And I'm also sorry, maybe there were too many statistics, but I think we have to keep that in mind. You know, statistics are a valuable tool